keep in mind, though, that evidence of overrepresentation, simply having more people of color, more Latinos or Hispanics in the system, does not mean that the decision makers in the system are biased. That's not an automatic deduction that you can make simply because of the fact that there are people, an overrepresentation of Latinos or Hispanics in that community. What we need to look at is empirical data, which is more convincing evidence of data by disparate treatment of youth. So we're not just simply going to look at overrepresentation, but where the true evidence comes from is that there's a difference in treatment of individuals once they are in the system. Okay? So I'm going to give an example of this. Is the National Council of Crime and Delinquency did an analysis of the overrepresentation of youth of color in California. This was just a recent report, and they looked at, unfortunately in this one they didn't look at Hispanics, but they did look at black youth in California. And they found that they were overrepresented in every stage of the system, even when we took statistical controls, meaning that we controlled for income, we controlled for perhaps gender or other variables that might influence the outcome. 72% of the black youth that were referred to felony drug offenses, for felony drug offenses, were detained. So 72% of the black youth that came into the system were detained. Now this is compared to 43% of the white population for the same exact offense, and holding everything else constant. So that would also mean like prior offenses. So they had the same amount of priors, so they have the same background, everything's the same except for the race. Okay? So, and again, we talk about accumulation going through the criminal justice process. We take it a step further. 11% of black youth with violent felony offenses were committed to the California Youth Authority, which is a detention facility, while only 3% of white youth, again for the same violent offense, the same background, so the same number of priors and everything, holding everything else constant, that the only variance is race. And then the National Crime and Delinquency Council found disparities in every stage for every offense category. So they found differences across race, even if it was a violent offense, if it was a property offense, if it was a drug offense, even public order offenses like public drunkenness or other types of what we call public order crimes. The only one that there was a difference, that there was not a disparity, was misdemeanor drug offenses, that simple possession. Okay? So the report concluded that they found a picture of, and here's a quote, persistent differential treatment for some minority groups after having accounted for factors such as the offense and the prior record. So this leads us to look at this issue of an accumulative effect. And the initial disparity that we see at arrest is then compounded by disparities that occur later in the process. And that includes all stages of detention, formal charging, which is a prosecutor's discretion. And you know that prosecutor's discretion is unfettered and unchecked. There's national guidelines for it, but there's no watchdog group that looks over patterns of usage for prosecutorial discretion. So when taken together, when we look at these disparities, they're rather small in the beginning, but they conclude in rather large effects. There is a study that was done a couple years ago by MALES, males, and the other name is MACALLAIR. And they looked in Los Angeles, and they wanted to look at this cumulative disadvantage through time, and they looked at it through the Latino and Hispanic population. And they show that on average, Latinos or youths charged with violent offenses were impacted over time. If we looked at arrest, youths, Latino youths, were 2.3 times more often arrested than white youths. Again, holding other things constant. It's not going to be good research if you don't hold everything else constant, okay? They were tried as adults. The youth were tried as adults. Latino and Hispanic youths were tried as adults 2.4 times as often than their white counterparts. And then they were imprisoned as adults, Latino and Hispanic youth, 7.3 times more often, holding everything else constant, than their white counterparts. So you can see the cumulative effect starts to slowly grow as we go down through the system. Now, what I want to focus on in terms of an issue is the drug wars, because I hate that term war when we're talking about a crime situation and a social problem. But this is how it is utilized. The United States Department of Justice does its own research on this. And so this data comes from our own government, letting us know that there's disparities in its own system. And they found the lifetime probability of being incarcerated in a state or federal prison is 4 times higher for Latino, Hispanic males than for whites. You know, an interesting side note, when I first started in the criminal justice system working, and I worked primarily with the African American community, it was 1 out of every 4 African American young men between 18 to 24 would be under the control of the criminal justice system. 20 years later, it's 1 out of every 3. So we have more people, young men of color, going to prison than we do college, which to me is a serious social issue to look at. And what we're looking at is the fact that the majority of these young men are going to prison, Latino young men, due to drugs and immigration laws. Now, this is an interesting twist when we look at the criminal justice system. We know that right now, and again we talked about the index, right? So we need to talk about how many Latinos are in the United States. There's about 12.5% of our total population. And again, that's not a good number because we're not counting how many people are not counted, right, through census. So we can imagine it to be higher than that, but let's just say it's 12.5. But they count for 43% of all people in federal prisons for drugs. So they're 12% of the population and 43% of the people who are in prison for federal. Now, you got to note that word, federal drug offense, and that's important. Latinos in the federal prison, and the reason this is all federal data is this comes from the United States Department of Justice. Latinos in the federal prison were more likely to be convicted of a drug offense they were also more likely to be a first-time offender, and they were the least likely to be convicted of a violent crime. So the Latino population in the federal prisons are the most likely to be in there for drugs, most likely to be in there for the first offense, and the most likely not to be in there for a violent crime. The per capita incarceration rate in California jails and state prisons, where we have a very strong population of Latinos, is twice that of whites. So double that, even though there are far more whites in the population. So you can really get a sense of the disparity. And again, we really see this in this age group of men between the ages of 18 to 29. They're actually aging up a little bit more. It used to be 24, but now they're actually saying 29. So here's some more empirical data about that. Hispanic and black federal defendants were more likely than whites to be charged for a drug offense.